So welcome, good morning. I'm Tracy Strading, the Michigan Assistive Technology Program Director at Michigan United Cerebral Palsy, or MI-UCP. If you'd like a sketch or certificate of completion, I put the email address in the chat box, so just send an email to that email address. I'm going to introduce Donna Case, who's an assistant professor in the Clinical Doctorate Occupational Therapy Program at the University of Michigan, Flint. She retired after working 30 years with low incident students in center-based programs in Wayne County. Donna has a BS in occupational therapy, an MLS in interdisciplinary technology from Eastern Michigan University, and an individualized interdisciplinary PhD in industrial engineering and occupational therapy. Please welcome Donna as she talks about AT and the IEP. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you for having me. My educational career is kind of tongue-tied, isn't it? Lots of things. So I'm going to now share my screen with you all. And please, if you have questions, feel free to ask them through the chat, or we'll have hopefully some time at the end as well for you to see that. So today I'm going to talk about assistive technology and the IEP. So hopefully that will resonate with you and some of your questions. So by the end of this talk, hopefully you will identify assistive technology requirements in IDEA 2004, which is our last reauthorization. You will be able to identify the process for how do we determine what a student requires in their to access their educational program. And then how do we document that? Because that's really important. And I think that sometimes that's the sticky point for lots of people. So I'm going to start with the case story because I like to do that. This is actually a true story of one of my students. So Jessica was a 3-year-old student who was educationally classified as severely multiply impaired. She had been diagnosed with cortical visual impairment, cerebral palsy, and had an unknown level of cognitive impairment due to the difficulties in evaluating her. And she also had severe seizure disorder that they struggled to control with medication and procedures. She began school at age 3 in a district where she is the only severely multiply impaired student, and she is the first to be diagnosed with cortical visual impairment. Jessica is nonverbal. She has difficulty with lip closure. She eats baby food textured meals, and she drinks from a bottle with thickened liquids. She requires assistance to have her diaper changed, to transfer in and out of her wheelchair, and to tell others what she wants or knows. Jessica's mother knows that Jessica needs additional support to help her access her educational program. And this includes a vision specialist who's been trained in cortical visual impairment, speech pathologists who are trained in the use of augmentative and alternative communication, occupational therapists and physical therapists who are familiar with the supports and access requirements that Jessica needs to be able to access her educational program. However, her school district repeatedly tells Jessica's mother that no one in the district knows about what she is asking, and they don't have the assistive technology that she is requesting. So, given that scenario, how successful is Jessica going to be in accessing her educational program? And you can put something in the chat if you like, question or answer, or I don't know if you're allowed to speak up, feel free there. But I see we've got one. Let's see. 0, absolutely. Jessica is being set up to fail. And I'm not sure that they're doing that in a conscious level. I don't think so. I choose not to believe that. But if Jessica doesn't have the supports that she requires to access her educational program, we are never going to know, A, what Jessica knows, and B, what questions she has or what she is requesting from us. And that breaks my heart. to think about that, because I know that the technology is there to allow Jessica to have that. So let's talk just a little bit about what is assistive technology and how is it defined and looked at in IDEA. As you know, in special education, IDEA is the driving force for everything we do in special ed in the schools. So IDEA says that assistive technology ensures that educators and parents have the necessary tool to improve educational results for children. And that could include preparing personnel, helping the teacher, the paraeducators, the speech pathologist, the gym teacher, the lunchroom people, the bus driver, in interacting with that student, in understanding how to use the technology and make sure that it's available to that student. It also includes coordinating that technology assistance in a way that everyone that works with Jessica is part of the system, understands what happens, and thus allowing Jessica to have the technology that she requires. It also includes the dissemination and support and the development of that technology. So what does that look like? What do we mean by assistive technology? Again, IDEA tells us that assistive technology device means any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether you get it commercially, whether it is modified or customized, that is used to increase or maintain or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability. So the term is not talking about a medical device that might be surgically implanted or might be required. For example, I had students who had tubes, feeding tubes that were surgically in place. That's not what it's talking about when it's doing it. So we're really looking at whatever that child needs to access their educational program. And that's the terminology you want to remember when you're asking for or you're advocating for technology. You want to advocate so that it allows that child to access their educational program. That is what IDEA is all about. So that's going to help you in moving through with that, okay? So what does assistive technology look like then in the K-12 environment? So the IDEA says that if an IEP team determines that assistive technology is required for the student to access their educational program, it must be provided to that student. Now, the piece that's the most difficult about this is an unfunded federal mandate. So the federal government mandates this, but there was no federal monies that came along with this requirement. So funds to purchase these devices often come from the general education fund of a local district. And that means that money is being taken away from the neurotypical children who are not in special education. It doesn't mean that the child doesn't deserve it and shouldn't have it, but it might explain why a district is reluctant to talk about or provide it. So it doesn't say, IDEA doesn't say you can request anything and the team has to give it. It's a team decision. And so one of the processes that I always recommend is called SET. It is widely used in special education. And the SET process is reminds us that we're looking at the student. We're looking at the environment, the task, and the tools. And so this is a process by which you can help guide the IEP team in determining what technology that student might require. So when we think about S, or the student, they are the central focus of the process. And everyone who is involved with that student needs to be part of that process and advocating for that student. So we need to look at what are the strengths of that student? What have they successfully used in the past? And it can be in school and it can be somewhere else. This is a data-driven process. So we need to have the data to support what we're talking about. So what do we know about the student? What has been tried before? And what worked and what didn't work and why? So that keeps our focus on, we want assistive technology that is meaningful and is appropriate to help that child access their educational program. Then when we think about this, and this is all happening before we start identifying assistive technology, we want to think about the environment in which that child is going to use that technology. And so we think about all of the environments in which that person is going to live, learn, and grow. I can tell you from my 30+ years working in the schools, I learned a lot of lessons the hard way. I guess maybe that's just how I am. And so I tell this to you as well. If the child uses a device to communicate, the voice doesn't stop when they leave the classroom. Don't they need to communicate when they are going through the lunch line or talking to people or friends at lunch? Wouldn't you want to communicate with the bus driver when you're on the bus? I know I wouldn't want my voice to be turned off when I'm in those environments. Is it realistic to have that device on in the playground? And it may not be, because depending on the age of the child and the other children, but certainly those pieces. Are they going to utilize it in gym? Are they going to use it in the hallway? Maybe they need that technology to go home with them so that they can use it for homework. And IDEA allows that if in the set process, you've identified very clearly the environments that that child has that deficit that you're hoping the technology will meet the need of. Then we start talking about tasks. What specific things does that person need or want to be able to do to access their educational program? And I highlight the word specific. We need to be very specific, because how are we going to know if we've been successful or not? How are we going to determine that this technology is allowing that child to do what we hope that it does? So we need to very clearly and specifically identify what they need to be able to do. If we have a child who needs to be able to have help with their spelling because perhaps they're dyslexic, so we want them to be able to access something that helps them with their spelling when they're in their writing, or they're in their social studies class, or they're in English class, or they're in math, because there's writing that involves in math as well. But we may say, but we don't want them to use whatever technology if they're in spelling and they're learning their spelling words, because that might defeat the purpose. So we need to very clearly narrow down what those tasks are, so that we can look at the data after they've trialed this device and say, yes or no, it's not meeting all of their needs. So then when we look at tools, we think about the fact of everything that's needed by that person, that student, as well as the people who are going to support that student in accomplishing the task in the places where it needs to be done. so that that child is making progress in their educational program. And it's really important for us to think about the fact that a tool by its very nature is going to require a learning curve time. So we need to identify what is the learning curve time? What do we know about the student and how long it's taken them to learn other devices or other technologies? What does the research tell us that most children need to learn how to use a specific technology? Because we don't want to make our decisions based on the learning curve time. We want to give the student time to learn how to use it. We want to give the classroom teachers and the other staff who are going to be interacting with that student while they're using the tools to learn that as well before we start collecting the data. Is this appropriate? Is this doing what we want it to be able to do? And so it's a process. And you'll notice we haven't identified yet what the specific technology is. So when we are looking at an IEP, we're going to be talking about characteristics or properties, not identifying a specific device. It's quite dangerous to put a specific device in an IEP. So for example, if we say iOS, they're going to be using a Macintosh computer, using the processing, and I don't know, is it 13 or whatever iOS is now. And in the middle of the school year, Apple changes to the version 14. We are now out of compliance if that child is now using version 14. So focus on the characteristics and the properties, because that allows us. And that means if we've trialed a tool and it hasn't worked, we don't have to necessarily go back and open the IEP. We're just going to hold another set team meeting and then look again at our characteristics. Have we missed something? And what other tool is out there that has those, meets those characteristics? So in that decision-making process, we identify that concern. We've talked about that. We're gathering all of the information on aspects that are related to concerns. It's important. I had a client who got a power wheelchair at school while they were at school, and we had not thought about the fact that the wheels were of different text height and makeup. And how is that student going to be able to get home on their bus with the tie-down system that was configured for their old wheelchair? So we need to be thinking about all of these information. I like a lot, I get into the details. So I'm a detail person, and I don't think you can have too much when you're first starting. Then we start to analyze that information. What does that information mean? What does it tell us? And then we're going to kind of generate a prioritized and potential solutions. So brainstorm what solutions meet that characteristic or property list that we've developed. And then let's go back and prioritize which seems to meet it the best. And from there, we're going to develop our plan. Where are we going to get the device? There are many places that you can borrow a device from. And we'll talk about that at the end to trial it. How long are we going to trial it? If they're using an adaptive laptop, who's going to help them plug it in? How frequently is it going to need to be plugged in? Do they need to leave class a little early because it's going to take some setup time when they get to their next class? These are the pieces that we need to really focus on, because that is often, if we don't, where the plan falls apart. Okay. Then we get the device, we trial it, we work the plan, we're collecting the data on effectiveness. And I'm okay with trialing something and it didn't work. I really am. We learn a lot from those. We can say, okay, here's something we didn't think about. Maybe they're distracted. There's a humming in that device that as it operates. And we didn't think about that because I'm older. I can't hear that humming anymore. So we'll add that to our list. And we revise the plan as the data drives it. Everything is data driven, and we document it. And that helps us as a team in determining what the technology needs are. Now, once you've gone through that process, you need to document that in the IEP. So you'll see, as in here, we've said the team says, how long are we going to trial a specific device? What type are they going to use? How will we define it being successful? And in which classes or situations will the assistive technology be trialed? You can place this directly in the IEP, or you can add it as an attachment, however works best for that district and how much leeway they have in their IEP document. But these should definitely be in here. Where can you also document it? Under the special factors section. There are two things that are in that section. One, it asks, has the team discussed the communication needs of the student? And has the team discussed the AT needs of the student? They can both be answered yes, and the student is deemed not needing technology. So a yes in that section doesn't say, oh, we've agreed this child needs technology. It just means we've discussed it. Okay? And if you as a team have decided and discussed, or a student already has assistive technology, that needs to be included in the PLAF, or the present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And it needs to be identified as what is the educational problem that that technology is solving, if you go back to the set process that we talked about. And when is that technology going to be utilized? Do they need it all day? Do they need it at specific times? Those are the pieces, and that needs to be addressed in the PLAF at some point. It doesn't necessarily have to say assistive technology. It can say, when we're talking about the child in math, well, maybe they need specific technology in math. And so we have identified what problems they have without using the technology. And so we can say, this is how they function without the technology. Here's how they function with the technology. This is the level that they're functioning at. Because it shouldn't just show up when we get to supplementary aids and services. It should be in the PLAF. That PLAF is so important in everything that drives that IEP. Then we need to, under supplementary aids and services, that can be where you can come to an IEP and say, I'm requesting an AT consultation and assessment. I'm requesting this set process. So we're going to go through the set process. We're going to work through it, and you can decide, depending on how you work with your school-based team, that we will amend this set process outside of the IEP, or we can say we're going to call the IEP to come back to amend it as needed. In that supplementary aids and services, you need to identify the trials that you're going to do. What assistive technology, what type of assistive technology? So if a student has difficulty writing, we would say the student is going to use text to speech, or speech to text, excuse me. So they're going to use something that provides speech to text, especially as we're learning what that process is and we're determining what that is. You need to identify the subjects, the situations, the times of day, and the environments that that technology will be utilized. And you also have to determine, and this needs to be included in this section, what is the data keeping method that the IEP team is going to use to provide information about the student's use of this assistive technology. So if we say in the IEP, this student needs a communication device in all environments, in all classes, every class should be taking some kind of data that says, yep, they have their communication device, it's working. It doesn't have to be anything more complicated than that, a checklist, however you want it to do. But if you don't have that data keeping method in this section, you can't prove when it comes time to the next IEP that the student has actually utilized the technology. So it's really important that that piece is in there. So where do we find assistive technology for students? Every ISD, ESA, or RESA receives federal funds under IDEA to purchase assistive technology for a lending library resource. They're a great place to borrow, to trial pieces. That's really important. Alt Shift AT has a lending library. The Michigan Department of Education has a low incident outreach, assistive technology for vision. There are monies if you have a child with a significant enough visual impairment that comes from the federal government for devices, technologies, additional supports. MI-MTSS also, and of course, UCP has assistive technology lending library as well. These are important places to trial. I would never want to ask a district to pay $2,000 or $3,000 for an eye gaze system that I haven't trialed with someone to determine that they actually need it. Because that is a sure way to get a district to say, not doing it next time, because you assured me this is what the child needed and it's now sitting in a closet somewhere. So it's really important for us to remember that. Okay. The other piece to remember is that any technology that is provided by the school district remains in the school district when that child graduates. So it's important in particular, if they're using a communication device, to start having that conversation at your transition meetings and talking about who and how are we going to apply to Medicaid if the child has Medicaid, or their insurance if they have that, to pay for their own device so that it's in place. A child has had a chance to utilize the new tech device. It might be exactly the same, but an updated version. So they have time before they leave school to utilize that piece. Now, going back to Jessica, if you remember from the beginning, Jessica's family moved into the catchment area of Cook School in Northville when she was 5 years old, because it had been recommended to them by a vision specialist that the state had brought in. At her intake IEP meeting, Jessica's mother insisted that she needed a method to communicate with others, and she indicated that she would fight for this. And I can tell you, having sat in at that meeting, she came into the meeting prepared to fight. And it was very apparent to those of us who were there that this had been the pattern in her previous district. Well, we all agreed with her, and we said, yep, we think she needs communication as well. And we usually start with a picture exchange system. And that's where we begin, so that she begins to initiate communication. We explained that to her mother. Then her mother said, well, she needs accommodations because she's cortically visually impaired. And, she had fought for this for her daughter in her previous district. And her daughter's team said, you're absolutely right. And talked about the accommodations that were in place school-wide, as well as in her classroom, for individuals with cortical visual impairment, as well as we talked about when we were able to work with Jessica and evaluate her and see what phase she was in, we would have additional accommodations based on her specific needs. Then the team said, well, not only do we think that she needs to have some kind of a communication system, but she needs to be able to access the computer because the type of cerebral palsy that she had impacted her arms, and she wasn't even able to bring them into midline and keep them there. We wanted to look for getting her started in on computer access as quickly as possible. And so we would look and evaluate her for a computer switch interface with an adaptive mouse, because again, as I said at the very beginning, we need to know, what does Jessica know? What has she learned? And what does she want or need? Those are powerful pieces and can be totally frustrating to the individuals and their families, and even the staff who are working with them, if they don't have a way to figure out, what does this individual need, and how can, and what have they learned? Where are they at in their learning, so that we can tailor our learning to Jessica where she's at and help her, hopefully bring her to more of her grade level. So that's just the beginning of all that I'm talking about. But now I want to answer any questions that you have, and being very specific about your needs. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can, at this point, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Let me know, what is it that I can answer for you that would be helpful in the terms of assistive technology.
I can also, if you want to raise your hand, I think I can fix it so that you can ask the question verbally if it's
That would be
better.
awesome.
Yeah. Oh, wait, I've got one. Let me see if I can figure this out here. Where is it? It'll show me. Okay. All right. I think you can speak now.
Oh.
Suzanne.
Oh, can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can. Awesome.
Great. So, all right, I'm the one that works at a furious speed. So is there a time frame that you have to work from a request for assistive technology for the implementation of the SET process?
There isn't anything, SET is not included in IDEA. It's just a really nice process to use
Okay.
it. So
Okay.
IDEA doesn't have that guidelines as to the process, but you can begin having that process long before they have the device. So I think it's something that you can request, and you can say, if you'd like to bring in someone to facilitate that process, that can be done as well. And say, let's start this journey, because it's not necessarily one meeting and we're done with
Right.
it. So yeah, I think that that's a piece. And I think that you can write that in the IEP. We would like, within a month to 4 to 6 weeks or whatever, as a team, we're going to start this process. I caution you in writing in the IEP the amount of time that the set's going to take. If you're going to write in a time, write a big range, because sometimes spanners just get thrown in as you're going, and you don't want to set yourself up to fail. But that would be my suggestion for you. And I would suggest that a child, for the most part, that you give at least 6 to 8 weeks in a learning period for them to learn the technology. Now, some things are different. If, for example, you have a child who uses an iPad for watching YouTube videos, for playing on apps, and you want to, use an app, they might need less than that amount of time.
Right.
So you can write that in, like, if we see this, this, and this, we're going to say the learning part is done. But you want to make sure that you give that. And a lot of people, I think it's human nature. We want it to be successful right away. Right? We go, okay, it's not working. And the worst thing that you can do is have a school district say, okay, we tried it for a week, it's not working. Right. Okay, no, we know it's going to take time. So absolutely. And I think it's very realistic of you to say, okay, we know we need to begin this process. So let's put it in the IEP. When are we going to, within a month or whatever, are we going to have the first meeting? Or maybe at the IEP, let's get people to pull their calendars out and let's schedule the first meeting.
That's kind of more, I've been in this for a while, and I tend to be a little jaded, and I've worked with, unfortunately, school districts that tend to, for want of a better word, stall.
Mm-hmm.
And, I see these children that desperately need this.
Yeah.
And, time flies and there doesn't appear to be a sense of urgency.
So put a date in there.
Okay.
Put a date in there. And say, hey, does a month seems reasonable? Let's do a month, or 6 weeks. I wouldn't go, I'd find it very hard to find any excuse that would tell me they couldn't start the process within 6 weeks.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Other questions anyone has? And if you want to learn more about the SET process, if you look up SETT, it'll take you, there's a whole bunch of really well-developed documents on their website that will help you tremendously in understanding. I've just given you a cursory talk about it, but it will help you tremendously. You don't have to be a professional to understand the language. They've very intentionally written it so everyone can understand. Any other questions?
I do remember talking to you about the differences between school districts, and I think I remember you giving some pointers about how to help move in the right direction. I don't know if I have that exactly right, but I remember a conversation around that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Here's the thing, and this is what I want to, if you go in and you say, my child needs an iPad or my child needs whatever, that's going to stall the conversation. So you want to come into the conversation is, my child is struggling. What does the data tell us? Because if your school district, if that child's class statement doesn't tell you where they're currently functioning, there's a problem. That's a requirement in the PLAC. So my child should be in the 5th grade. Their math scores tell us they're in the 1st grade, or their reading scores tell us they're in the 1st grade, or the section that talks about communication tells me they're not where they should be. That's a great place to start the conversation. Here's what I always tell people, and it's not so much with younger children, but with children who've been receiving therapy, who've been receiving specialized services. So we've tried, maybe we've modified assignments. We've done this, and yet they're still not caught up. They're not on even a trajectory. They seem like they fall farther and farther back. So now what are we going to do? We've tried this. The data tells us it's not, because either A, they haven't been taught it in an appropriate way, or B, the child themselves hasn't tried. And usually when you begin to talk about that, people are, no. And in my experience, teachers they're trying to teach it appropriately, and children are trying their very best. So there's a barrier there. So when you go in, and it's again, focusing on what do we need? My child needs to be able to tell, because they need to know. Teachers, school districts are being evaluated by the state and the federal government based upon how their students are doing. And if you haven't figured out a way that you can, how do we know what this child knows? How can you provide any data in doing that? So coming in from that, let's look at what the data tells us. There seems to be a barrier. have you been teaching this student this subject? Has the student been trying their best? Then that leads us into what can we do next? Because Albert Einstein says the height of the definition of insanity is to continue doing what you've always done and expect a different outcome. So what can we do differently? And where do we come from with that? And having that conversation. And you can have that conversation before, it doesn't have to be brought up the first time at the IEP. You know, when you're having parent-teacher conferences with your child's teacher and the team, begin to lay those seeds. Okay, so, you know, they're making progress or they're not. Maybe they are, maybe they're not making enough progress. What are we going to do differently? What can we change this quarter, this marking period, to see if we can improve my child's ability to move through their educational program, and always focusing on educational program. IDEA doesn't provide anything if it isn't directly related to the child's educational program. And it also doesn't say that you have to provide the very best of the most expensive thing. Tracy and I were talking before you all came on, and I did a presentation last week to Whirlpool Corporation about designing for people with disabilities, and that sometimes all the bells and whistles that we like as technology people and as designers make it really difficult for an individual to do the things that they want to do with that appliance or tool or device. So really, in that set process, being very specific about what does the child need to be able to do, and then only focusing on that. Now, you may want to think about this child is progressing and they're going to get better. So does that device have some capabilities to expand with the child? You may have a child who has a progressive neurological disease. And so physically right now, maybe they're able to walk with a walker, but we know that they're going to end up in a wheelchair, or we know that the writing that they're able to do is going to get less and less for them. Does the technology that we're providing right now have that capacity to grow with them? The other thing that I would like to share with you that sometimes comes up, people will say, if the student gets a communication device, then that's going to stop them from talking. And the research tells us that it's absolutely not true. That the secondary benefit of providing some type of alternative or augmentative communication device actually helps a child be able to develop their verbal skills. And the same thing for when we're looking at, maybe you have a child who is severely dyslexic, and the team has decided that perhaps a dictionary would be helpful for that child. And there are talking dictionaries. You don't have to be able to spell close enough to be able to see what it is. And people may say, well, but is that giving him an unfair advantage? Is that going to keep him from being able to learn how to spell? As someone who is an absolutely horrific speller, because I'm an auditory learner, I actually spell better in French than I do in English because it follows better rules. That's not true. That doesn't help. That doesn't stop either. And if we think about writing, I've had parents of children who were 17 or 18, and they say to me, you know, I really want my child to be able to write. And I do too. But we go back to the data and we look at, for 5 years, we worked on this, then we worked on this, and the child physically does not have the coordination to be able to do that. It doesn't mean that we can't continue to work on writing, but we need to access their educational program, usually around 4th and 5th grade, because that's when the demands of writing increase. We need to start looking at some kind of typing or speech to text program, because do we want them to spend all the time trying to form letters and words, or do we want them to be able to tell us what they know? And those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask. It doesn't mean that we can't work on writing their names so that they can sign documents, although at some point maybe we get them a name stamp, because that is the only document that I am aware of that you cannot use a name stamp is a passport. Every other legal document you can use a name stamp. But that's where you come from, is it fair to the child to say we're only going to work on improving your writing when they need to be able to produce written information? We can do both. It's not mutually exclusive, and typing does not preclude somebody from learning how to write better. So hopefully that answers, and maybe more, Tracy, than what you wanted me to talk about.
No, that's great. Does anybody else have any questions?
I'm going to share one more time, and I will give you my contact information. So if you have questions, you can always email me, and I'm happy to, okay, hopefully you can see that, and I can get this is my contact, where is it? There's my contact information. My email, I'm happy to answer any questions that I might be able to help you with. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you all today. It is always my hope that all students in the state of Michigan have the best educational outcomes that they possibly can. And this is one way that some students can achieve that.
Lovely. Good. So it looks like Suzanne is saying thank you, and that it will be helpful in advocating. Does anyone else have any comments or thoughts they'd like to share? All right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Donna. I always learn so much from you. I feel like it's a breath of fresh air, the direction that you come from when you approach as a person with a disability. I just find it refreshing that the emphasis is where it is when you talk about assistive technology for folks. So thank you so much. I'm going to talk a little bit now about September. September's presenter is Michael Bray. Michael is an instructional designer, researcher, and data analyst that has worked in the developmental disability field since 2003. His primary area of interest lies in the design and implementation of inclusive, accessible learning environments that enable diverse adult learners to develop new skills and knowledge. He's been the MI-LEN training director since 2017. The MI-LEN program trains emerging leaders with the goal of improving the health of infants, children, adolescents with or at risk for neurodevelopmental disabilities and other related healthcare needs. MI-LEN is a collaborative effort of 6 universities, which he'll tell you about when he comes on. So he's going to be speaking on September 8th at 10 a.m. about autonomous vehicles and persons with disabilities. So we'll be having that conversation at 10 o'clock on September 8th, and you're all invited to join us. Thank you very much for being here today. And let us know of any topics that you're interested in, and we will do what we can to find speakers on those topics. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much.